Welcome to everyone joining us today online for the ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Manisha Dutta, and I'm Academic Director of the Animals in Society Research Initiative, ASRI, here at the University of Victoria. Our interdisciplinary research unit is based in the Faculty of Law, where I also hold the Lansdowne Chair. Here at the University of Victoria, we'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging the respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The Animals in Society Research Initiative, for those who may not know, is an interdisciplinary forum at the University of Victoria for all research that promotes critical thinking on human, animal, and interspecies relations. For information on our work, please do visit our website, and Holly right now is posting the link on the chat for you, as well as an email address for ASRI if you'd like to receive our monthly e-newsletter and stay up to date with the latest news and events in animal law and animal studies. We'd like to acknowledge the generous funding of the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for this lecture series. Thanks also to our co-presenters at the university for this lecture, the Faculty of Law, the Department of Political Science, and the Center for Studies of Religion and Society. We are welcoming a wide range of participants today from several countries. Thank you all for joining us from all your time zones. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Margot Michel from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, presenting under the title Eroding Boundaries Between Humans and Animals and Their Legal Implications. Dr. Michel is professor of law at the University of Zurich, Switzerland. She holds a chair of private law, comparative law, animal protection law, and philosophy of law, and is co-founder and co-director of the Center for Animal Law and Ethics. I must comment that I had the tremendous good fortune to be at the center during my study leave last academic year and witness the tireless efforts of Dr. Michel in building up that center to be a leading hub for animal law in Europe. In addition to animal law, Dr. Michel's research interests include the rights of vulnerable persons generally in law, family law, and medical law. Her monograph, Rechtsgemeinschaft mit Tieren, Eine Spurensuche, searches for traces of animals in the law from the past to the present. We will have time following the presentation for a Q&A period, so please post your questions in the chat, and I will be delighted to read those out at that time. So with our warm welcome, I will now turn it over to you, Dr. Michel.
Dear Manisha, dear Holly, dear members and listeners of the Distinguished Lecture Series, dear audience, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to speak to you in this setting today. And Manisha mentioned it. She was in Zurich for a research stay and visiting professorship in the academic year 2023 and 2024. The collaboration with Professor Decker has been extremely inspiring, and we have initiated projects that we are currently still continuing. I am very grateful for the valuable contribution that Professor Decker has made to our research community in Zurich, and I'm all the more excited to now have the opportunity to contribute to this pioneering project at the University of Victoria, the Animals and Society Research Initiative, and to present within the framework of the Distinguished Lecture Series. Thank you very much for inviting me. Two of my research foci are in the areas of animal law and medical law. And over the course of this talk, I would like to explore an aspect that spans across these two fields of my work. When delving deeply into these two fields, one cannot help but notice the striking differences that emerge between the treatment of humans on the one hand and animals on the other. More precisely, it becomes apparent how differently human and animal bodies are treated. And I will share my presentation now. However, this is a perspective that is mostly not addressed from a legal point of view, how differently human and animal bodies are treated. It is particularly not addressed by colleagues who work solely in the field of medical law. Generally, the aspect of the body, embodiment and corporeality, has so far been considered very little, if at all, in traditional law. And here I speak mainly from my continental European perspective and leave it up to the participants from other jurisdictions to decide if this is also the case within your respective traditions. This is in contrast to philosophy, where the philosophy of the body and embodiment has been an important topic for quite some time now. However, there are some colleagues in animal law, and I will mention them today, who interestingly have a similar combination of research focus as I do, and also work on the meaning of having a body in law, embodiment and corporeality. I would like to shed light from a bird's eye view on how the law deals with bodies and what significance bodies hold in law. Specifically, how the legal status, treatment, and protection of animal bodies differs from that of human bodies. Given my background, I do this from a European tradition, which may differ in some respects from the legal tradition in the English-speaking countries. I will point that out when I'm aware of it. The normative differences, as well as the fragility of the traditional arguments that justify these differences, become particularly evident at the margins, where bodies can no longer be definitely assigned to one category or the other, human or animal. I have worked in depth on this and other aspects of the human-animal relationship in my habilitation, which is published in Springer Nature Open Access. Holly has kindly translated the chapter from this book I am mainly referring to today, and she has made it available to the audience in advance. I would like to express my heartfelt thanks for this extraordinary service. In my lecture, I will primarily refer to this chapter, but will also include other aspects from my research and other parts of the book. The boundary between human and animal is becoming porous, headlined the Süddeutsche Zeitung in an article on research involving human-animal hybrids, dealing with the question of whether pigs can be genetically modified to develop human organs that can then be used in human transplantation medicine. Human-animal hybrids are living beings that have neither a fully human nor a fully animal body. The German Ethics Council defines human-animal hybrids as living beings that contain both human and animal material to varying degrees, if only to a small extent. A now almost classic case involved the implantation of functional animal cells or tissues as they naturally occur into a human organism. These procedures are regulated in many countries. The regulations in Europe on this topic are quite more or less similar. Today's possibilities for interspecies manipulation go far beyond the insertion of animal cells, tissues, or an animal organ as they would naturally occur into a human. They concern the level of genetic information. An example of such human-animal hybrids are transgenic animals, which are frequently used in animal research. In their cells, the genetic information is altered, and in some animals, human genetic information is introduced. Nowadays, a variety of transgenic mouse strains are available, as we can see on the website of this company that even advertises with Swiss quality, as you see on this slide. The mice are available with different genetic configurations, and thus the areas in which they can be used also differ. For every research project, there is the appropriate genetically modified mouse, with precisely the characteristics and features desired by the researchers to answer a specific research question. How animals become mere commodities, things to be used by humans, fully instrumentalized for external purposes, can hardly be better illustrated than by such an advertisement, one might say, and I am drawing very loosely on the phrasing of a colleague working in property law at the University of Bern. The topic of creating human-animal hybrids has been occupying the public for some time now. Such news is always received with great interest, sometimes also with concern. But is the creation of human-animal hybrids really particularly problematic? And if so, why? What is so special about it? Isn't it just another form of animal use? another form of selective breeding, which is largely permitted by law. Why does it cause alarm when the boundary between humans and animals, as the Süddeutsche Zeitung headline puts it, becomes porous? What distinguishes the genetic modification of animals using human genetic information from other forms of use? What happens to the law as we know it when the boundary between human and animal begins to crumble? Is this boundary even fixed on the body and genetic information? And finally, should and must it be guarded more closely in the future than it has been so far? To at least try to give an answer to this question, I would like to take 2 steps back and firstly briefly explore with you how much animals count in the law today, that is, how their treatment, especially the treatment of their bodies, are legally regulated. This is because the primary focus of most human interests is the animal's body, which is fully instrumentalized for human purposes. For example, in animal experiments, the body of animals is used as a measuring instrument when reactions to interventions, medications, toxins, or pollutants are studied. Therefore, it is imperative to closely examine the body and the discussion surrounding its status and significance in the law. Interestingly, it is precisely the physicality, the characteristic of having a physical body, that humans and animals share as biological beings. With physical constitution comes a certain form of vulnerability. Humans and animals are beings that, as legal philosopher Christine Korsgaard describes, can experience things as good or bad for themselves. Being rooted in the civil law tradition, all European countries have animal welfare legislations. This is also the case in Switzerland, which I use as an example of the arguments I make. The regulations are quite similar in other European countries, especially with regard to the argumentation that is being used to justify the legal treatment of animals. The aim of the Swiss animal welfare regulation is to protect the dignity and well-being of animals. I will come back to the notion of dignity shortly, but would like to stay on the topic of well-being for a moment. Welfare is usually connected to the animal's ability to feel pleasure and pain and to experience suffering. This ability is usually described as sentience. In most countries, it is the reason why animals are legally protected at all. Correspondingly, the scope of the Swiss Animal Welfare Act is limited to sentient animals. The regulation aims to protect animals from suffering, pain, and harm. However, despite being legally protected in all European countries, at least to some extent, animals are still widely treated as assets, production factors, or testing and measuring instruments. How is it possible that animals are modified according to external interests, genetically altered to fit certain research goals, and advertised with regard to their genetic qualities and properties, like mere commodities, when they have a dignity and welfare that the law requires is respected? This situation arises because the law protects animals only within the context of their intended use. The protection of animals' interests by law is therefore dependent on the context in which the animal is situated, that is, its intended use. Swiss law makes this explicitly clear, as you can see on this slide, where I have depicted the relevant article of the animal welfare law. This intended purpose, the purpose the animal is used for, is external. It has nothing to do with the animal itself, but it is determined by humans. Thus, the legal protection standard is a variable of a human interests, almost fully dependent on the use humans put animals to. And being from Switzerland, I would like to add a few comments on the notion of dignity of animals at this point. Swiss law explicitly protects the dignity of animals and defines it as the inherent worth that animals have, and that must be respected when dealing with them. Dignity is a crucial notion in the European legal tradition, but it is usually reserved for humans. Human dignity is a concept that informs the law at its core, which is the reason humans have rights in the first place and why they need to be respected and protected by law. It was called a right to have rights by philosopher Hannah Arendt. It is therefore deeply connected to having status as a legal person, to be recognized by the law as somebody with rights. The notion of dignity draws heavily on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. He was extremely influential in European legal philosophy, and his thoughts and concepts remain important to this day. I would like to read to you a key tenet of Kant's philosophy. In the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. Whatever has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. On the other hand, whatever is above all price and therefore admits no equivalent has dignity. But that which constitutes the condition under which alone something can be an end in itself does not have mere relative worth, that is a price, but an intrinsic worth, that is a dignity. In Kant's view, animals fall into the realm of things, as they have no autonomy as he understands it. They are not able to follow rules they have given to themselves. They lack the capacity to follow ethical standards they have given to themselves, and they lack the ability to self-govern. This ability is what he calls autonomy. Whoever is autonomous, whoever has the ability to self-govern, has dignity and therefore is a person in Kant's sense of the word. Humans, having the ability to self-govern, must fall into the realm of persons. Persons, as beings with dignity, may not be instrumentalized, they may not be used as mere means to someone else's ends. This is the essence of being a person in Kant's view, to be protected from being used as mere means to someone else's ends. He says it like this in the English translation. Beings whose existence depends not on our will but on nature's have nevertheless, if they are irrational beings, only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. Rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves. That is, as something which must not be used merely as means, and so far therefore restricts freedom of action and is an object of respect. Now, what does this excursion into Kant's philosophy might have to do with the question of how the bodies of animals and humans are regulated by law, you might wonder. I hope this will become clear in the following explanation. The consequence of belonging to the realm of things is to have a price, to be a commodity, to be subjected to serving someone else's ends. That is the essence of being a thing and having a price. I would like to highlight one more thing briefly, and then we will put Kant to rest. Have you noticed that person and thing are mutually exclusive categories in his philosophy? He clearly states, in the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. This will become important when we now look at how the law regulates bodies and, above all, when we examine the concepts behind these regulations. Against this background, and to return to the initial question, let's have a closer look at the fundamentally different legal treatment of human and animal bodies in law. Looking for traces of living bodies in the law, one quickly finds examples. Regulation that concerns the beginning and end of personality typically use the term life, alive, and dead. Some regulations concern themselves with bodily harm and its financial consequences. Others address the violation of psychological integrity. The body and bodily integrity are also protected in criminal law. And finally, the human body, and only the human body, is the subject of the entire medical law legislation. Animal bodies are regularly mentioned only marginally, primarily as resources, for example, in xenotransplantation, or as measuring instruments and safety nets for the development of new procedures and medications. Therefore, the observation of the English legal scholar Mary Fox also applies to Switzerland, and I'm sure to most jurisdictions. The body of law remains a distinctively human body. But what interests me the most in this context is the legal status of the body. In European traditions, the human body itself cannot be treated as a thing. The living human body, along with its parts and substances, is not subject to property law. This applies even when it involves artificial objects that are firmly connected to the body, such as artificial heart valves or a hip joint. These lose their status as legal things in the moment they become an entity with the human body. They are no longer legally controllable, albeit remaining a physical three-dimensional object. Whatever or whoever is legally classified as a thing cannot be a person. The living human body and its associated parts and substances are not subject to property law, according to prevailing European doctrine. They are withdrawn from marketability and legal control, although they would fundamentally fulfill the central dogmatic criteria of the definition of a thing, corporeality and actual controllability. If the living human body is not considered a thing under the law, then property rights over it are also not possible. This prevents different individuals from having ownership and personal rights over the same living human body or its parts. The separation between the mental aspect of a person and their physical constitution is foreign to continental European legal thinking. Body and person are traditionally viewed as a unit. They are inseparable. There's also no self-ownership over the body for this reason. I will come back to this. At this point, we remember Kant. Everything has either a price or a dignity. An entity with dignity is a person, not a thing. It has no price. It doesn't allow an equivalent. It's not interchangeable. Therefore, the person with its body falls under the realm of personality rights, not under the realm of property rights. The most significant consequence of the exclusive application of personal rights to the human body is the exclusion of external instrumentalization. Interventions in the living human body are generally only permissible for the person's own benefit, at least as long as the person has not consented in the intervention, or it does not concern criminal or judicial contexts. We again remember Kant, to whom the idea that persons must not be instrumentalized for other purposes, that they cannot be treated as mere means to someone else's end, can be traced back. However, while the human body is not an object, but is subject to personal rights, the bodies of animals are still treated as objects and as such fall under property law. Now, to make the argument clear, I will omit the fact that animals are no longer nominally considered things in many legal systems. This trend is also very strong in Europe, where animals are no longer classified as things by law in many countries. However, they have not become persons as a result, but continue to be treated as property-capable legal objects. Therefore, I will leave out this nuance for the following argument. For those interested, I have provided further reading references on the last slide. Let's return to our line of thought. In comparison with the human body, the animal body receives very little attention in law. However, at least the Animal Welfare Act can be read as a text that mainly deals with the body of animals. Their integrity is protected under criminal law, and elsewhere the law speaks of their well-being, defining it, among other things, as ensuring bodily functions. The body itself should be protected from pain and suffering, at least as far as this is possible within the intended use of this body, as we have seen. However, this protection is not always the case. The animal body also functions as a measuring instrument in the Animal Welfare Act. For example, when it is used in animal experiments to test a scientific hypothesis, to determine the effect of a specific measure on the animal, to test a substance, or to obtain or test cells, organs, or bodily fluids. Furthermore, the genetic material of animals may be artificial or altered. The protection against pain is not absolute, especially in the context of animal experiments. And finally, even the aliveness of the body is not protected. It can be transformed into a dead body in the name of human interests, with the Animal Welfare Act only regulating the how of this transformation. Thus, despite the fundamental claim to protection by animal welfare legislation, animal bodies are comprehensively objectified and instrumentalized. They are, as fully controllable and physical objects, completely integrated into economic utilization contexts. Prevailing social values may explain the subjection to property law and the fundamentally different legal treatment of human and animal bodies. However, there is no ethical justification for it. The human body functions very similarly in biological terms to the body of other mammals. It is equally as vulnerable. And yet mammals are among the animals most used by humans, whose bodies are fully instrumentalized for external purposes. When one does not allow purely economic interests to suffice for the classification of animals under property law and subjects them to an ethical review, the question arises as to what extent the differences can be substantiated and to what extent they are merely the result of discrimination. What are the significant normative differences between human and animal bodies from a legal perspective that justify subjecting one to property law and the other to personal law? Do they relate to the personhood status of humans? And if so, how does this relate to the body? As I mentioned at the beginning, the relationship between body and person has so far been little explored, and the corporeality or physical constitution of humans has only recently come into the focus of legal research. In the legal text itself, especially in civil law, bodies still hardly appear, so that sometimes even the disappearance of the body from the law is spoken of. Its vaporization between persons and objects, as two colleagues of mine call it. And I hope now that you can understand this expression against the backdrop of Kant's legal philosophy. Bearing that in mind, it certainly is not surprising that bodies disappear. They have, and here I must briefly bring Kant back into the picture, no intrinsic value. Autonomy, the normative self-legislation, has value, but not the body itself. Interestingly, however, mind and body are not separated in Kant's philosophy, but belong inseparably together. Building upon Kant, the European civil law tradition primarily links rights not to a living body, but to a legal construct, the person. However, at least the human has not entirely disappeared from the law, and humans, unlike a spiritualized person, necessarily have a body. It can be stated, rights are not linked to having a body, but to the person. However, person and human body form a unit according to traditional understanding. The human body is therefore legally privileged because it is inseparably connected with a person, a human. The physical constitution of humans and their mental nature are, therefore, inseparably connected and equal from a legal perspective. Body and mind together form the person. Here I quote Andrea Büchler and Birgit Christensen. The law assumes a congruence of human being and natural person, whereby the physical constitution is a fundamental and hardly questioned characteristic. This idea, which is central to the traditional continental European legal tradition, goes back to Kant. He recognized the physical constitution of humans and questioned the strict body-soul dichotomy postulated by René Descartes, and you might also have heard from it. Kant believed that thinking, feeling, and sensing encompass the human being in their entire physical existence. The I, in Kant's view, cannot be reduced to the brain, as a dualistic perspective following Descartes would claim. Therefore, human and person are congruent, with the embodiment of the person being a fundamental and hardly questioned characteristic of human life. In modern legal systems, the protection of the human body has moved away from the notion of autonomy as defined by Kant. Although this concept is still frequently used to justify the special status of humans, the human exceptionalism, many rights, and particularly the right to physical integrity, actually protect humans as physical beings, primarily in their physical constitution. Rights thus do not protect an abstractly conceived human person, but first and foremost the human as a physical being. In the words of contemporary legal scholars Regina Kierner, Walter Kählin, and Judith Wittenbach, it sounds like this. The guarantee of physical integrity protects the human being as a physical being. In conclusion, it can be stated that rights are not attached to the possession of a body, but to the person. According to traditional views, the person and the human body form a unity. The terms person and human coincide. The human body is therefore legally privileged because it is inseparably connected with a person, a human. The idea of comprehensive consideration of physical constitution, embodiment, means more than the fact that humans and animals have a body. It reminds us that they are a body. This means that being in a body affects all the dimensions of life. The physical constitution of every living being determines its perspective on the world. According to this approach, all cognitive, mental, and conscious experiences are intrinsically embodied and essentially embedded in an environment. As philosophers Jörg Fingerhut, Rebecca Hufendieck, and Markus Wild put it in their book about the philosophy of embodiment. They make the point that conceptual thinking and perception are far more influenced by physical abilities and the nature of the body and the environment than is usually assumed. This means, in relation to humans, that a specific human way of thinking, feeling, and acting is conditioned by the physical constitution in a human body. The body, therefore, is not merely the appendage or vessel of the person, but inseparably connected with them. Given this finding, the legal treatment of those beings that have neither a fully human nor a fully animal body, human-animal hybrids, must now be of particular interest. This term refers to living beings that contain both human and animal material to varying degrees. The designation does not yet imply any statement about the ontological or normative status of these beings. Mixing human bodies with cells or tissues of animal origin is already commonplace in modern medicine. Xenotransplantations, which involve the implantation of functional cells, tissues, organs, or body parts from animals into humans, are not fundamentally excluded in most jurisdictions. This is also the case in Switzerland. Only primates, the closest relatives of humans, are not allowed to be used as donor animals under Swiss law. Today's possibilities for interspecies manipulation go far beyond the insertion of an animal organ into a human. They involve the level of genetic information. An example of this group of human-animal hybrids can be found in the transgenic animals used in research. The genetic information of their body cells is altered. The creation of living beings that contain both human and animal genetic information and pass it on to their offspring is a normative quantum leap from both a legal and ethical perspective. However, it was barely discussed for a long time. In 2011, the British Academy of Medical Sciences was still of the opinion that the creation of transgenic animals did not pose any significant new ethical problems compared to other types of animal-consuming medical research. Bioethicist Nicola Biller-Andorno, however, formulates the challenge that human-animal hybrids pose to a normative order as follows. Traditional Western ethics clearly distinguishes between the moral status of humans and that of animals. This clear separation is challenged by hybrids. A pig with a human liver is probably still a pig. But what if the pig also had a human heart? Or if it had human neural tissue, if the brain were at least partially altered in a human way, or if the pig's organism contained a certain proportion of human cells scattered throughout its body. What moral status do we want to assign to these beings? The normative boundary is thus rooted in the biological boundary. Belonging to the human species immediately conveys the status of a legal person. Human-animal hybrids carry the potential to completely erode the identity of body and person. However, the creation of human-animal hybrids, which arise from the introduction of human genetic material into animal germ cells or embryos, is not prohibited. This is the case with the creation of transgenic animals. They are created in large numbers. According to the Swiss Genetic Engineering Act, it is permissible to produce genetically modified vertebrates, provided that is done for research, therapy, and diagnostics on humans and animals. However, the law does not define how many human mutations may be made before an animal is so humanized that it should actually be treated legally as a human. Interestingly enough, the Swiss constitution prohibits the introduction of non-human germ and genetic material into human germ material or its fusion. Thus, human germ material is protected, but not animal germ material. The creation of hybrids, that is, living beings that arise from the mixing of human and non-human germ cells, is therefore prohibited. These prohibitions are immediately understandable when one realizes what consequences the law attaches to the classification of an entity as a human. Humans are persons and have rights as such. What is not human is not a legal person and has no rights and can therefore be largely instrumentalized. But isn't it surprising that the law apparently perceives the danger of erosion of the boundary between human and animal only from one direction? You might want to look into that in your respective jurisdictions. But under Swiss law and most European countries, humans must not animalize in the eyes of the law. So human germ material must be protected from mixing with animal material, but not the other way around. Manisha Decker has also done research in this field, and she identifies species anxiety in regulations that prohibit the animalization of humans. She writes, when species lines are troubled, it causes anxiety because the humans involved become animalized, as Carrie Wolf terms it, and thus absorb the subordinate status assigned in Western cultures to non-humans in general. In contrast, the humanization of animals is apparently considered far less problematic. Human material may indeed be introduced into animal germ material. That is how transgenic mouse are created. This creates regulatory gaps. Also, the Swiss regulator is adamant that the fundamental barrier between man and animal must not be breached. While the law tries to guard this biological boundary vigilantly, its course is increasingly shifting due to rapid biomedical developments. The boundary becomes permeable, it crumbles, it becomes, as we saw in the newspaper article at the beginning, porous. The legal regulatory gaps contribute significantly to the perforation of this boundary. They allow the creation of human-animal hybrids, thus softening the boundary that the law actually wants to protect. The German Ethics Council statement on human-animal hybrids provided a separate opinion, asserting that the dichotomy must be maintained at all costs, as it is normatively absolute, and here I quote, constitutive for our society, it decisively determines who belongs to the circle of privileged legal subjects. The normative is rooted in the biological boundary, while at the same time, the current law does not define what actually constitutes the body of a human. How should the resulting hybrids be treated normatively? Are they categorized as humans or animals, or should they form their own category? And on what criteria is the normative classification based? If previous criteria such as being born from a human mother obviously no longer apply. Does a being have to look like a human to be considered human? Will the number of human genes determine who is human in the future? Or will the presence of functioning human neural cells be the criterion for human life, analogous to the concept of brain death? The discussion about the anthropological difference, which has been ongoing since antiquity, seems to be resurfacing under the conditions of modern biomedicine on fundamentally different levels. The questions are extremely complex and can only be touched upon in this context. The decision about which genes make a human human depends, of course, on the prior answer to the question of what the human actually is. This question can only be answered normatively. But any regulation that bases the legal qualification of a living being on its genetic composition carries the risk of falling into a scientifically disproven genetic essentialism. That is, the assumption that genes are causally responsible for the development of certain traits. Everything is dangerous because any criterion of being human would exclude certain humans. Current law does not define the human body, and thus the body of the natural person, and there are very compelling reasons to not change that in the future. Considerations as to whether people with significant deviations from a physical norm are even humans and legal persons seemed grotesque and relegated to legal history until recently. In the past, physical and mental characteristics were indeed discussed as prerequisites for legal capacity. However, the normative anchoring of any criteria regarding the nature of the human body or mind carries the risk of excluding people with different physical or cognitive functions and conditions. There are therefore in the current law neither specific physical characteristics nor cognitive abilities that a human must possess to be normatively recognized as a legal person, as legal philosopher Birgit Christensen explains. With this equation of human and person, it is ultimately the species affiliation that decides whether someone is a person or not, and the status of a person is decoupled from moral or cognitive abilities in the legal context. This took into account Kant's idea that personality is based on the idea of humanity and adopted his rigid separation from other world beings. So far, it has been sufficient not to be an animal to be recognized as a human and thus as a person. Further specification seemed unnecessary, as Mary Fox explains. Indeed, law's construction of the human body, which is seldom explicitly articulated, seems largely rooted in an assumption that humans may simply be defined by virtue of their opposition to animals or machines. The traditional method of defining the specifically human is based on a negation of the animal. Combined with the normative devaluation of the animal and the animalistic, it first carries the risk of underestimating those aspects of human existence that humans share with animals. Corporeality and the accompanying experience of being a being that, as Christine Korsgaard puts it, can experience things as good or bad for itself. Secondly, the traditional definition of being human almost inevitably involves the fear of losing one's normatively privileged position through practices that threaten to dissolve the human-animal dichotomy. In the desperate effort to maintain the strict dichotomy between humans and animals, which is so constitutive for legal capacity, the German Ethics Council, in its statement on the human-animal hybrids, consequently considers how hybrids could be argumentatively and ontologically assigned to one category or the other. It says, the Constitution does not make any statement about the fundamental rights of a human-animal hybrid. A hybrid legal status between human and animal is foreign to it. For a statement on whether a being is entitled to fundamental rights, protection, or falls under animal protection, a classification as human or animal must be made. The Constitution does not provide any guidance on the criteria for this classification. Now, one can resolve the dilemma by forcing a dichotomous classification through a careful ontological analysis to determine whether the specific hybrids should be conceptually assigned to humans or animals, so that the rules of human ethics or animal ethics apply. However, the German Ethics Council itself doubts this method, and rightly so, one might add, when reading this. This analysis can, at least in some cases, lead to the conclusion that such a dichotomous classification is not convincingly possible, resulting in a true hybrid between human and animal. It must be decided whether the blending of traditional categories, their mixing, damages the established evaluation category and how to deal with it. If the chimera clearly appears as a neither nor, as a new entity between human and animal, then all traditional ontological distinguishing features are mixed and dissolved. It is therefore questionable how long the legal counterpart to the crumbling boundary between humans and animals can be maintained in its current form. The temptations are now too great, for example, to address the shortage of human organs by creating human-animal hybrids. Despite the effort to adhere to the categorical boundary between humans and animals, one does not want to forego the advantages that arise precisely from the genetic proximity between humans and animals, and thus from the fact that this boundary is actually gradual. The use of the proximity relationship requires, in certain contexts, precisely the crossing of the species boundary, and thus further contributes to its erosion. This can be addressed in two ways. One can try to fortify the boundary, or one can think about its meaning. Is it really appropriate to continue to base a normative order on boundaries that are dissolving? Should something as fundamental as legal capacity really depend on an argumentative ontological classification? The German Ethics Council considers the phenotype as relevant to the decision. It states that it is certainly relevant to the decision whether a being is phenotypically clearly experienced as a human, clearly as an animal, or as a hybrid of unclear species classification. Whereas that sounds convincing at first glance, it harbors the danger, which can hardly be contained, that such an approach would represent a regression to times when physical constitution was decisive for human quality, when deviations from the defined normality had catastrophic consequences. It would be a step back to times when the appearance and physical traits of a human were decisive for their legal classification. And I will include some reading suggestions on this in the last slide. But who determines which appearances are specifically human? And what happens to all those beings who clearly descend from a human and carry exclusively human genetic material, but whose external appearance differ from this declared normality for some reason? Given this scenario, where the categorization that is absolutely fundamental from a legal perspective, as it decides on legal capacity, is based on such contingent criteria, the helpless and essentialistic proposal by the German Ethics Council to categorize by, and here I quote, counting or estimating the number of cells of both species almost seems desirable again. I would like to conclude with a thought from the philosopher Christine Korsgaard. Korsgaard follows Immanuel Kant in her moral philosophy. She believes that rationality morally distinguishes humans from other animals. However, she does not believe that this leads to moral superiority, and she considers what value the norms or the moral laws actually protect, which humans as moral beings in the Kantian sense give themselves. According to Kant, this should be human autonomy. Korsgaard disagrees. Many moral laws, especially those that protect physical integrity, are directly related to vulnerability and corporeality, that is, to the part of existence as a biological being that humans and animals share. And our look into the contemporary understanding of the protection realm of rights to bodily integrity has shown us that this is indeed the case. Physical integrity protects humans as physical beings, as defined by Regina Kräner and Judith Wittenbach. The purpose of many rights is not to guarantee an abstract rationality, but to protect, much more fundamentally, physical well-being. According to Korsgaard, the protection against torture, injury, or killing is not about protecting human autonomy. Rather, it is about protecting the animal nature in humans. She says, and many of those natural concerns, the desire to avoid pain is an obvious example, spring from our animal nature, not from our rational nature. If this is true, then it is simply a matter of consistency, in Korsgaard's view, to treat animals in this regard the same as humans. If humans, as moral, self-legislating beings, attribute normative significance to their animal nature, that is, the ability to experience things as good or bad for themselves, this normative significance must also be recognized in animals. To summarize Korsgaard's argument, which further develops Kant's approach, if humans set themselves as ends in themselves, as we know from Kant, and in this position make laws that protect their own animal nature, they make a decision. That is, they use their ability to create ethical principles according to which they want to live. They decide that we can be good or bad, that what can be good or bad for a sentient being is a normative value, a value that must be protected. Humans attribute moral value to themselves not only as autonomous beings, but also as beings with natural needs that are tied to the physical constitution of their life form. Consequently, humans must consistently protect the same animal nature in other living beings in the same way, according to Korsgaard. In her view, this is simply a matter of consistency. Therefore, it is essential to consider what can be good or bad for animals as sentient beings. Thus, animals are also ends in themselves, a conclusion where Korsgaard diverges from Kant. She states, in taking ourselves to be end in ourselves, which legislate that the natural good of a creature who matters to itself is the source of normative claims. Animal nature is an end in itself because our own legislation makes it so. From these considerations, Korsgaard concludes that animals should be recognized as rights holder, even though she does not believe that the same legal category appropriate for humans is necessarily suitable for animals. Animals are not deficient humans, but should be protected in their otherness and difference. Therefore, to meet their specific needs and abilities, animals should be classified in their own legal category. The question of what such a category could look like, what it encompasses, and what changes it would bring to the legal system would be the subject of another lecture. For today, I would like to conclude with the observation that the biological boundary between humans and animals is beginning to blur because humans are gradually eroding it through technical process and progress. It is therefore time to rethink the ethical and legal justification of this boundary. And I have provided some further reading on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michal, for that wonderful reading of the current situation and introducing us to that portion of your recently published habilitation. It's so rich and thought-provoking and provides a wonderful contrast to, I think, what many of us are more familiar with in terms of the Anglo-American tradition, both in philosophy and in law. We will open it up for questions. So again, if you have a question, please do place it in the chat and I'll be happy to read it out as well. But if I may take the moderator prerogative to pose the first question, I was thinking then, well, for example, the first thing I would wanted to ask Margot is the contrast you drew between Descartes and Kant in terms of how that has factored into the European situation. I know, for example, in Anna Greer's work of a professor who does a lot on the anthropos, at kind of and unpacking the idea of what really is like at the heart of the international legal order and also domestic legal orders in terms of the legal subject, and has cautioned that when we use terms like anthropocentrism or even Anthropocene and make claims, that we should be careful to avoid an undifferentiated invocation of humanity. And in fact, that it is, I think, in her wording, a human hierarchies of being, not just human, non-human hierarchy that has structured the history and much of what remains of the kind of world we live today, given appropriative industrial expansionism. So in that work, I think she takes care to notice a difference between Descartes and Kant in terms of their treatment of the body, but then does place Kant in the end, like in as a theorist who believed in a transcendental self, and such to reach her conclusion that this idea of a disembodied rationality really is in the international legal tradition, and in many domestic European legal traditions. And that's a history not just from Descartes, but also from Kant. Would you read it the same way, or are you articulating a sharper difference between Descartes and Kant in terms of whether the Kant's sense of rationality in the person was so disembodied as Greer would want us to accept?
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. It was a really very interesting one, and I have thought quite a lot about it. And I found that the difference between Kant and Descartes on this point is quite big. Even so, you would not think it at the first place, because René Descartes made a very distinct difference between the mind and the body, and which he gave them even separate names. And you can also see that in his treatment of animals, how he treats animals. And he sees them as, he makes a very stark contrast. He sees them as Markus Wild has put it, which you also know, the philosopher in Switzerland, as mere bodies, because they lack the mind that Descartes attributes to human. Humans have, in his view, body and mind. Animals are only bodies. And because he equates having a mind with having a soul, so he makes this connection between mind and soul, and so therefore only humans have a soul in his view, whereas animals are like machines. They can mimic emotions, they can mimic feelings absolutely perfectly, like a clock, he puts it, because this was the beginning of the industrialization and all these machines coming into effect. They can mimic it, but they do not really experience it. This is what Korsgaard means with you experience one own good or bad. And Kant is very different in this. He has a publication where he says, is what he sees in his dreams. And then he speaks about that, where is the place of the human mind in the body? And he searches for this place in his body, and he says, I am not in my brain, and I'm not in my fingertips, and I'm not in my leg. I'm everywhere in my body. You cannot separate it from, you cannot separate the mind from the body. It is, in his view, it is very much like a unity, and he is like he argues this, especially in answering Descartes. And this is also, in my view, the thoughts from René Descartes are still very, very like important in the natural sciences, where the bodies of animals are often still seen as something like machines. And this explanation concept, then when an animal reacts, it is only a reaction to a stimulus that is coming from the external world, and not something that is driven by like a concept of maybe building a nest or anything like that, when the same behavior in humans is something that is guided by our will and autonomy, it is seen in animals still as an external stimulus, often, always, often only, not always, but often. Then I think there is still some Descartesian thinking and mind-body difference that is shining through this.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful answer. We have a question in the chat from Melissa who asks, might primates be classified as persons under the law in the near future?
I don't think so, because what is the difference between humans and animals in the concept of the law is the species affiliation. The modern law systems don't have a definition of prerequisites that persons have to meet to be like a human person have to meet. So this is the reason why I think that concepts that try to define certain traits in humans that then are researched in animals, and when the animals also show these traits, then they should be persons too. I don't think that this will lead to this success, because, and also it would be dangerous, in other words, because then we would all, at the moment we begin to define what actually makes a human a person, we would always lose some humans in this process. So the attribution of being a person must remain by being in the like stem from the species affiliation. But that does not mean that we cannot open the category for animals too. But I think it has to be with respect to their difference too, so that we don't lose humans in this process when opening it. Coast Guard talks about like opening the kingdom of ants. Like you take up new inhabitants, but you don't want to lose inhabitants that you had until now in this process. And this would especially be at the moment you start to define like certain aspects of being a human that makes a human, you would always lose the most vulnerable ones.
And we have a question that Julia would like to ask orally. All right, Julia.
Yeah, hi. Hello, good evening.
Hi.
Understand me? Yeah, you can. Thank you for your talk, first of all. It was very inspiring. My question is, I have sometimes heard the question when discussing about animal rights, that there is the argument that animals should also have duties when they get rights. What would be your answer to that question?
Yeah, this is a very, very old argument. It was discussed since ancient times. It is this reciprocity argument between rights and duties. And at the moment where this was found convincing, animals were considered as somewhat deficient because they don't have the ability to have duties. And this was for a long time the argument, and it is still always sometimes referred to today why animals cannot have rights. Kant believed that. Kant was of the strong opinion that you have to have both. You have to have rights and duties to belong to the kingdom of ants. But I think the argument from Christine Korsgaard is much more convincing, and I would like to explain it to you now because I find it so convincing. She says that she also believes that the rationality is what differs us from other animals. So this is something that may holds us under the duty to act according to ethical principles. This is what separates humans from animals. It's our ability to self-govern, to accord our behavior according to our ethical values. But what follows from this, is her argument, is not that that we have no duties to other animals. What follows from it is that we are bound to ethical duties and animals are not, because they don't have this ability. This is simple like consequence. it does not puts us in a higher hierarchical space. It simply says we have to follow ethical duties, but the animals do not. So the reciprocity argument is not convincing today, I think. There is also the differentiation between moral agent and moral patient that most modern philosophies use. That a moral patient is somebody that only has rights, that must be considered ethically, but cannot himself or herself follow ethical values. Also a little child or a person with severe cognitive like problems cannot, or somebody in a coma cannot, and also animals cannot. But this means that they this does not explain that they don't have to be ethically considered.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Julia. Okay, we have another question from Holly, who says, I especially appreciated the important truth that, quote, animals are not deficient humans, end of quote. Do you have any comments on legislation for animals in research in European countries and progress on the shift to non-animal research methods?
Yeah, this is actually this is a big project of ours, and Katarina Stoikova, who is working on this sub-project of our big research project, is also here today. We are trying to research why this gap is so big, and I can announce a paper that will come out shortly in the European Journal of Risk and Regulation, if I say it correctly. And if I do not, Katarina, maybe you can put the link into the chat. So I think it would be published in the next week, a paper about this gap and what could be the reasons where the non-animal methods are still, even if they are available, so little used.
Terrific. And one from Kishore. Isn't it hoping against hope or asking for the moon to expect arguably selfish human beings to treat non-humans as equals?
Yeah, this is a very important argument. It's also an argument I hear a lot against animal dignity. What point does it make to protect animal dignity when it is so much violated all the time? And I think this is the case with all human rights too. We don't stop to have this this claim that humans have rights and that we must protect them and work towards better protection of human rights, even if it is violated in so many parts of the world all the time. And the same comes true to animal rights or protection, or whatever their legal category would be, is that it is not an ethical argument that it is violated not to put the claim on it. And law is like the instrument that makes this ethical claim like verbindlich. It make it I don't find the English word, that you have to follow it, because the law has the instruments to make sure that you follow it. And this was something that was really like something that was new. Can't believe that it is the way we have to treat animals. And he thought that we have to treat animals good. He wrote quite a lot about animals, and also how we have to treat old animals that we have lived for a long time, or an old like dog, for example, or an old like donkey that has made so much service to us, and how we have to treat them when they're old with love, he writes. But he did not believe that we can transfer it into rights, because he believed in this reciprocity argument. But today, this is no longer the case. It has to be transferred into rights, into the law. And so we have the instrument to, like with every vulnerable being, to really make sure that these principles are respected. this is often it is not the case, because there are still people that don't follow it so consequently as it should be followed. We all know that, but I still think this is the way to go.
Thank you, Marco. We have another question from Ken. Thank you for your presentation. I wonder how is it that the same animals can have different recognition under different pieces of legislation? For example, how dogs can be deemed differently under an Animal Welfare Act and a Medical Experimentation Act.
Yes, this is a very important point, and it has to do with this intended use that I have referred to at the beginning of the explanation of the legal system. It is very made explicit in Swiss law, more explicit than in other regulations, but it is at the core of nearly almost all animal welfare regulations, is that the animal is always seen in the context it is used for humans. It is still not entirely like decoupled from human interests. And this is a great weakness of animal welfare regulation that is often criticized, because this is something we need to overcome if we really want an efficient protection of animals. And I myself think it is not something like mutually exclusive, because also with children, we have these both concepts. We have protection and rights. And I think this should be the case with animals too. We have to not to lose this protection side, but maybe like add the rights perspective to it. And then we would come to a much better system.
Margot, may I ask you, just on Christine Korsgaard and the idea of opening the kind of terrain to more inhabitants, what would be your response to the argument that Raphael Fazal discusses in his recent book from Oxford University Press, More Equal Than Others, taking on a long-standing historical argument in both in the French tradition, more well-known in the British tradition, but basically an aristocratic equality argument that says, we can't, in as much as we might recognize that animals have interests equivalent to humans, and that's why humans need protection, we can't let animals in because it destabilizes a critical, easy boundary, the species boundary, that would then jeopardize the humanity claims, which grants a protection for the most vulnerable humans. And so the contemporary iteration of this argument is, from some critical disability rights scholars, certainly not all, that in as much as they sympathize with animals and recognize their plight, that they couldn't support bringing animals into a coveted space of moral and legal protection because it would blur the human boundary in a way that would be jeopardizing for vulnerable humans, humans made vulnerable for their legal claims because of a compromised cognitive status, most typically. So we saw this argument come into the intervener submissions of the Happy the Elephant case at the New York Court of Appeals. So Happy is elephant in the Bronx Zoo. And about 2.5 years ago, the New York Court of Appeals, 5-2 decision. So there were judges in dissent, but the majority accepted some version of this argument. Would your perspective be the same, or how would you answer the claim about, well, we sympathize with animals, but we have to keep them out in order to uphold who's already in?
Yeah, this is really the argument that we brought up is really very often heard. And I also hear it a lot also with animal dignity too, that the notion of animal dignity weakens somehow the notion of human dignity. And then it would become weaker, and especially vulnerable humans would become more threatened if this is upheld. But I don't think this is the case, because this argument comes from a concept that has like a concept of thinking behind it, that there is so much to share. And if you give more to somebody, you lose something in the other person. In German, we say Nullsummenspiel. So you equate to zero. You have always the same amount to like share. But this is not the case with protection. We can protect animals and not lowering the standards for child protection, for example. And we did not lower it actually when we introduced animal protection in the legal system. And we did not lower the standard for human dignity when we introduced animal dignity in the system. So it is not something that has to, there is nothing to lose by introducing this concept. I think the only like danger is that you begin to define like traits or characteristics that you must meet to come into this protection that then would also apply to humans. Then you would really run into this problem. But if you are careful not to do that, then I don't see that this would be really a danger.
Mhm. We have another question from Kishore. Can theology or theosophy encourage humans to be compassionate towards other species? And that may especially relate to the concept I would just add myself to dignity, because am I right in suggesting that one of the reasons that dignity has particular traction in Switzerland and other European countries relates to its more kind of original religious iteration in Judeo-Christian traditions?
Yes, this is very true, Manisha. The notion in Switzerland of animal dignity relies very much of this religious tradition that we are like shepherds on the world, and we have to respect animals in this regard as somebody that is given to look after, but not to harm, and that they have their own rights also in the world, that humans don't possess the world as themselves, but they only guard it. So this is the concept that is behind it. But I think too that religion or this, I would also like expand it a little bit in the philosophical tradition that lies behind this concept also that protect humans as human beings that we have seen now, that they can really also inform the and motivate for better treatment of animals. And if I can go back to Kant for a second now, he had great influence in establishing animal protection in the German-speaking countries, even if he is often criticized for his like putting animals into the realm of things. But in his concept, he put humanity first, and humanity in his eye is not the species of being human, but it is the capacity to self-government. It is the morality that he calls humanity. It's our capability to hold ourselves to ethical values. And he said that our treatment of animals is a perfect duty against our humanity, against ourselves. So we damage our own humanity if we don't treat animals well. This is what he believed. So this is a very, very ethically, it's a very, very strong argument to protect animals. He did not believe that it can be transferred into a legal system because for him it belonged to an ethical realm. But it is a very strong argument, and it was really influential for establishing the first animal welfare legislation in Europe, because then you have this notion of animal protection is also protecting humanity, meaning our own dignity depends on it, how we treat animals.
Thank you. Ken has just followed with a comment. Thank you. I feel some of these pieces of legislation dealing with the context animals are extraordinarily contradictory in law when the same species are regulated differently. So just a follow-up comment. And Margot, I'm cognizant of the time. May I just ask you one more question, because I would love to know your opinion. In some of the Anglo-American debates that take the common law as a backdrop as to what's possible for animals, some authors have forwarded a more hybrid concept of a legal subjectivity for animals, so like a mix of person and property. So trying to deal with the current situation and acknowledging the property status of animals is not going to go away very easily or very quickly. And then trying to reach into the common law and to show that, oh, well, you know, there is a history of recognizing rights even when a being is still classified as property. And so hoping that that will move us along to a personhood endpoint, but in the meantime, to recognize animals as being more than property, and this hybrid status, like quasi-person, quasi-property, is an argument Professor Angela Fernandez has put forward, and David Faber before that, this idea of living property for animals. So this idea of a property plus, as Professor Fernandez says. Given what you've shared with us and analyzed even more deeply, do you think this type of hybrid status is more or less feasible in the civilian context?
Yes, I think the concept is extremely interesting, but I also see the chances for success more in the common law tradition, because of this stark dichotomy we have between persons and things. But I do think that animals can be much stronger protected as they are now under the status as being things, and also even when they remain property. And that is because I believe that the main problem is not to be property. In the tradition I come from has two concepts. One is you belong to another person. The person is, and this is a concept that we know from different fields of law. I do also a lot of family law, and we also have this line of responsibility with the when parents are like the person who is in charge of their children and they decide certain things for their children. So this like legal attribution to someone is not the main problem in my view, but the commercialization that goes with it. So that the being can be commercialized, that it has a price, that it is marketable. That is the problem. And I think we need to lose that aspect first. And this is not so much a leap, because the law knows already certain categories that are not marketable. And I could not explore on that tonight, but I have written something about it in my book. It is a normative decision that the law makes, which aspects are marketable and which not, with a very common example is human blood. In Europe, you cannot commercialize human blood. You are not allowed to sell your own blood. So you have to donate it. You cannot be paid for donating it, or you cannot be paid for donating a liver. You have to, and it's not liver, then you would die. But you have to do it without financial compensation. This is because this is excluded from the marketability. Even if it becomes a thing, at the moment it is separated from your body. The body becomes the blood becomes a thing, but it is not marketable still. And I think this is a concept we could transfer to animals quite easily. It would legally, I mean, in the legal concept, it would or certainly have very drastic effects on the commercialization of animals as a society as we use them. But as a legal concept, it would be nothing very new, but quite feasible, I think.
Thank you so much, Margot. And especially thank you for the wonderful comparative insights that we would not be able to receive ourselves. And you have done an enormous amount of work, the chapter that you've shared, and look forward to the English translation coming out and being able to, or improving my German sufficiently to read it in its original, but that's going to take up several years, I'm sure, if not more, probably a decade. Anyway, it's such a late night for you and everyone who's joined from Switzerland and Europe. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And there are many thank yous in the chat as well. I'd also like to thank the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for funding this lecture series. Thank you to our course presenters at the University of Victoria, the Faculty of Law, as well as the Department of Political Science and the Center for Studies of Religion and Society. This lecture concludes the current year's Distinguished Lecture Series. If you can join us in person on March 14th, we're looking forward to our 4th annual lecture in Animal Rights Law and Policy here right at the university with Professor Pamela Frasch, Professor of Law, and the Brooks McCormick Jr. Scholar of Animal Law and Policy at Lewis and Clark Law School. If you'd like to stay up to date on all our upcoming events and news in general, the world of animal and animal studies, and you're not already on our newsletter list, just email Holly at the link provided at the top of the program, and we'd love to welcome you. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Michal, and
Thank you so much
everyone
for
for
inviting
joining
me.
us. It was such a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.